Hightower's going to speak, and you folks are going to stick around. Jim Hightower's going to stick around too, so don't you worry. You get a chance to have him sign a book for you. But stay around for a minute, because I want to introduce you to my friend Matt Gonzalez. And I want to tell you why Matt Gonzalez has come out here all the way from California. Matt Gonzalez is a native of McAllen, Texas. His mom grew up in Mexico, his dad on the Texas side of the border. He is as deeply rooted in the soil of that state as, well, Jim Hightower, but not George Bush. He didn't go off to Andover and places like that. He has his roots there, but he went up to San Francisco. This man got elected without the support of the Democrats or the Republicans, got himself on the San Francisco City Commission, became the president of that city commission, almost got himself elected mayor of San Francisco, and he did it living in an apartment with roommates, writing poetry, doing everything that they tell you a politician can't do. He is the most uncommon politician in America, and he is one of the most absolutely important and vital advocates for election reform we have. If you want to have elections that work in this country, you listen to Matt Gonzalez. Please welcome Matt Gonzalez.
Let me just say, a couple of years ago, I made a decision that I was not going to vote for any political candidates who had supported the Patriot Act. And a couple of years later, I made a decision that I was not going to ever vote for any politician who had supported the war in Iraq. Consequently, I did not vote for John Kerry, and I'm very proud of it. And I want to tell you why we have a serious problem in our democracy and why we have to do something about this recurring problem that many of you in this audience ultimately get confronted with when you go to the ballot, when you don't want someone like George Bush to be elected. Now, I want you to think about for a moment what it is when in a democracy a candidate steps forward that has views different than the two major parties, doesn't support the war in Iraq, doesn't support something like the World Trade Organization, doesn't believe there should be 2 million people in the jails in our country, somebody who's talking about the issues. How is it that we greet candidates like that with this overwhelming call for them to drop out of the race? Why is it that we attack them in a democracy for standing up and holding views different than the other candidates? Now, I want you to think we're here celebrating the tradition of Bob La Follette, but tell me this, I mean, he ran as what? A progressive. He did not run in one of the major parties by the end of his career, and I think it's important that at a festival such as this, we stop and we get serious and we say to ourselves, look, the presidential election is over. Let's not kid ourselves. Every policy that we as progressives are unhappy with, the Bankruptcy Reform Act, you name it, these things have happened with the complicity of the Democratic Party. So what are we going to do about it? Well, let me tell you something. After the 2000 election that Nader, many say, cost that election, if I were a Democrat, I would have spent the next 4, 8 years, you name it. I would have been fighting to make sure that never happened again. 4 years passed, and what was the Democratic solution? It was an undemocratic one. It was to say to candidates with different views, you're not allowed to run in our democracy. In San Francisco, we did something different. I was the president of the council. I'm a member of the Green Party. I brought forward something called instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting. It allows you to go to the ballot box and in a single trip to the ballot box to rank your choices. So you got your first choice, second choice, third choice. If it had been used in Florida in 2000, you could have voted Ralph Nader 1, Al Gore 2. You count up the votes, nobody has a majority. Maybe George Bush is in first place, Gore's in second, but neither has a majority. You eliminate the bottom vote getter, Ralph Nader, and everybody that voted for Ralph, you go to those ballots and you go to their second choice. And you do that algorithm, and then you see if you have a majority winner. And I think Al Gore would have won that election. Now, I think it's fascinating to me that only the city of San Francisco, led by a Green, could be pushing for this kind of reform. How is it possible that the Democratic Party lost the United States presidency and there's one single Green guy in San Francisco trying to make this change? Well, interestingly, there was a ballot measure in Alaska about a year after we did this in San Francisco, about the same time, and it would have applied to all federal elections in Alaska. Ranked choice voting would have applied in the last presidential race. Well, the Democratic Party did not support this reform. We have a serious problem. The only reason it's not being discussed is because there wasn't a spoiling of the 2004 election insofar as somebody was voting for that third candidate. But that's not to say it isn't going to happen again. I went a couple of months ago to Washington at the invitation of Lynn Woolsey to speak to the Progressive Caucus. I spoke, Lynn Woolsey was there, Congressman Conyers was there, Barbara Lee, others were there. And I told John Conyers something I want to tell you. I said, you know, John, this thing, instant runoff voting, is not a Green solution. It's actually a Democratic Party solution, and it was first used in the United States of America back in 1975. It was used in an Ann Arbor, Michigan mayor's race because in Ann Arbor there was a third party called the Human Rights Party that kept spoiling elections. People would vote for the Human Rights Party, and the Republicans would win with a plurality victory. So they came up with this neat idea that you should be able to rank your choices and end up with a majority winner. Well, in the first round of balloting, the incumbent Republican mayor got 49% of the vote, James Stevenson. The Democratic challenger, Al Wheeler, who happens to have been a friend of John Conyers, got 40% of the vote. And the Human Rights Party, Carol Ernst, had 11% of the vote. Well, in the old system, the Republican would have been declared the winner and the race was over. Well, in the new system, they dropped Carol Ernst out of the equation, went to the second ballot of all those folks, and Al Wheeler was declared the winner with 51% of the vote. It has worked. Now, the Republicans got the local newspapers to editorialize against this method of voting, and here we are, 30 years later, still trying to make our democracy work. I implore all of you, if you have principles, then you must vote for the candidate that you believe in, otherwise you're throwing your vote away. And if you go to the ballot box and somebody tells you that there's a problem with you voting for the candidate that you believe in, why don't we fix the system of voting rather than gang up and attack good American patriots who are fighting against, you know, all of the problems that we've been discussing today. Let me close by saying the winning strategy, as it's been put before you, isn't a winning strategy. The Democrats too often are basically, with things like the Patriot Act, they try to see which way the wind is blowing. You know, how many people are lined up on one side or the other. That's how we got into this mess in the first place. The Greens that have gotten elected and into office have fought for good reform. They've done it in Madison, they've done it in San Francisco, they've done it in a lot of places. In San Francisco, we passed the highest minimum wage law in the United States of America. It's now at $8.63 an hour, and it keeps going up because it's got an indicator for the cost of living changes. If at the next presidential election you go to vote for president and somebody tells you not to vote for the candidate that you want, at the very least, I want you to ask them what they've done for the last 4 years to make this reality go away. I know as a Green what I've done, helped implement a system for change in a major city in America, gone to Washington to talk to the progressive leaders. Let's demand change, or let's vote for the candidates we believe in. Thank you.